Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Nicola, and this is Jim. And first of all, we'd like to thank the British Council for inviting us along. We were not aware that this was the first higher education conference, so no pressure for us there. We are going to present on our research and our thoughts on the growing global phenomenon of English medium instruction. As we saw from the vote there are a number of perceived benefits of switching from teaching in the student's mother tongue to transitioning to teach through the medium of English in higher education. A number of perceived benefits, including enhanced employability opportunities. There's also a number of different driving forces behind this growing global trend. But despite the perceived benefits, there's a number of challenges and complexities. Implementing sustainable and successful education policy implementation is a complex process. EMI has become a trend. The growth rates are phenomenal. But the perceived benefits cannot be guaranteed without careful policy implementation and facilitating dialogue between researchers, practitioners, and policymakers alike. I don't want to start on a negative. But I hope in today's presentation that we will highlight the complexities surrounding this rapidly growing trend. The internationalisation of higher education has become a priority for universities around the globe. This takes many forms, from internationalising the curriculum, setting up foreign exchange programmes, partnerships, publishing in international journals, collaborating in international research projects. But in non-Anglophone contexts, this has increasingly become synonymous with switching to teach through the medium of English. Over half of the world's students today are studying through the medium of English. And as I mentioned, the growth rates are really quite surprising. Provision is rapidly outpacing research into the affordances and complexities of this phenomenon. We've witnessed then a worldwide shift towards English medium instruction. It's been referred to as a galloping phenomenon, pandemic in proportion. It's become one of the most significant trends in educational internationalisation in the world. As Ernesto Macaro referred to it, I like this metaphor, it's almost like an unstoppable train. You know, the speed of provision is like a Japanese bullet train. There's not much we can do about this, but what we can do is ensure that our passengers get off safely at each station, and I like this. Initial growth was in Europe, and this is where the majority of the EMI research has been situated. But the reasons behind the growth in EMI are really quite different in the European context to more emerging and recent EMI contexts. We saw a tenfold increase in EMI programs in a decade in Europe. The leading disciplines are business, economics, engineering, technology, but in recent years we've seen this move into other disciplines across the university. This was an increase from 725 to over 8,000 in 2014. In just 13 years, this was a 1,115% increase in EMI provision in undergraduate and postgraduate provision. This trend is happening worldwide, however. In places like Japan and China, we've seen a string of highly funded government policies encouraging growth in EMI. Because of the money involved as well, this is where we're also calling for research into, well, is this a cost-effective move as well? As I mentioned, provision is rapidly outpacing empirical research, and we're calling for the need almost to slow down and to look at quality of provision as opposed to quantity. University rankings in places like Japan and China and elsewhere are now influenced by the amount of EMI provision. In China, if a university provides over 10% of course undergraduate provision in English, they're ranked as being excellent universities. Under 10%, they're ranked as being poor. The number of EMI programs has almost doubled in 20 years in Japan. In China, we have an average of 44 English medium institutions, English medium programs per institution. Although, as Jim will point out, this really depends on how we define EMI. EMI is a commonly defined term, but it's quite problematic and conceptualized in very different ways. So what we've seen then with the growth in EMI provision in higher education is that English medium instruction has spread from the more mature EMI hotspots, such as the Netherlands or Northern Europe. These are the more mature EMI contexts. As Dearden pointed out in one of the first British Council-sponsored EMI studies, the general trend is towards a rapid expansion, and this is having a fast knock-on effect in other nations. And we've seen EMI growth in places like Turkey, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia in recent years.
Okay. This question was connected with our online voting system we don't have access to now. But the question, why is EMI important in internationalizing higher education, has a number of different possible responses, of which we had them built into the system, but we don't have them for you here now. In which case I will move on to our...
Do it with the driving process slide.
All right, okay. The reasons behind the implementation of EMI as part of an internationalization in higher education movement is inextricably linked with a few key points. One of the first ones, of course, is the realization that English has become the academic lingua franca. In Nicola's report that was mentioned by the ambassador earlier, 94%, in fact, of research is published in English. In 2010, Morin and Heinonen and Ranta said English is unquestionably the world language of academia. And we see these ideas confirmed further in the work from Nicola and Heath Rose in their books on global Englishes. This is a very clear way of seeing the trend. 100 years ago, yes, English was a very important language in academic publication, but so were other European languages, and even Japanese is on there. But we see then from about 50 years ago that started to change dramatically. And since then, English has established itself as the academic lingua franca. And of course, there are a number of reasons for this, but publications being a big one. Now, EMI and employability is the other big area and big reason for the importance of EMI in internationalized higher education and the theme for this conference. But there are a few key things that we need to think about. First of all, in the research, what we see are a lot of examples of people understanding, believing that EMI is good for employability. And we saw that in your vote in the beginning of this session here. And we have examples of this in research from around Europe, in China, as well as in our neighbor here, Kazakhstan, of where we have many representatives here today. And here we have EMI strengthens universities' offer to students who believe studying in English will make them more employable. So we have some pretty clear ideas about these beliefs. What we need to investigate more now is how does this actually happen, and is there evidence of it? The driving forces for EMI, yes, we see enhancing employability of graduates. This is an important part of the popularity of EMI. Fostering intercultural competence that is attractive for the increasingly internationalized job market is another one that's a little bit harder to explain and describe and indeed investigate. But it is an important one that we understand is a huge reason for people's interest and wanting to study in the medium of English. There are, of course, a few dissenting voices out there about this. For example, Robert Wilkinson's work in the Netherlands, one of the original locations for EMI, Netherlands, one of the hot spots, right? Graduates may find their employability limited if they cannot handle their academic learning in their L1. So thinking about the realization that people aren't learning through English so that they can then work in another place, right? They're learning through English so that they have the ability to function in an international and global community in their home countries. Being able to function in both languages is very important. We don't want to lose sight of that. And Nicola? Yeah.
I just want to follow on that from there about EMI and employability. So EMI does definitely enhance students' employability opportunities, and Jim mentioned their intercultural competence. This is a key graduate attribute in both Anglophone contexts as well as non-Anglophone contexts just now. Universities are keen to develop the intercultural competence of their students, and as we know, particularly in EMI contexts that recruit a lot of international students, the EMI classroom is becoming a very internationalized one, and therefore fosters opportunities for students to develop these skills. We also wanted to add today that with the growth in EMI, it's also creating employment opportunities for TESOL practitioners. With the movement towards teaching in English, students definitely need support, and this is something that we'll also focus on today, the lack of support that we've observed in a lot of universities that we've visited, different approaches to support as well. This will definitely create job opportunities for those of us based in the UK, for example, and elsewhere. Exploiting new ELT markets is an objective in the UK government's international education strategy. The ELT industry is a huge money-making industry. At present, it brings in 1.2 billion and 26,000 jobs to the UK. But the point I want to make here is that this isn't only for Anglophone nations, that we're going to see an increased demand for EAP practitioners in other contexts as well, and we would definitely call for working with local practitioners because we feel there's not a one-size-fits-all way to implementing this policy, and we call for a context-sensitive approach, and that's something we'll come back to at the end. So, oh, sorry.
Stay here with me. Okay. A really important issue about EMI, and the way that we're talking about it as the main theme for the conference here, is we need to ask ourselves, is EMI an educational strategy, or is it a marketization strategy, or is it both? There's some really important considerations here, and what we see is, for example, things like the increase of international student numbers. This is good. This is good for the university. It brings in money. It's also good for educational opportunities, right? We recognize that the chance for students, local students, to interact and learn alongside international students is a good one. Right? We recognize that these global approaches to education, different educational backgrounds, allows people to understand things differently. International education for local students as a concept is both an educational strategy and a marketization strategy. When we think about what we're using to promote EMI, we need to think about what is the real reason? What are we able to say about this? How can we ensure that as an educational strategy, there's still a market value to it? Evaluation systems for quality assurance is a really important part of what we're doing in terms of moving forward with research in this area. There's been a lot of EMI implementation or provision without research. Evaluation systems may not be in place. I overheard people talking about this already over coffee this morning, saying we have English medium instruction in our institution, but we don't have any real way of understanding how well it's working. Right, we have nothing in place. This is all part of what we're looking at in developing more, but recognizing as well that professional development systems and evaluation systems don't necessarily work across all contexts, right? We have very different needs in different places. EMI training is the point that I raise in relation to things like professional development. British Council supports a lot of EMI training, and as well as a lot of the research that I've done as a research associate of the University of Oxford's EMI Oxford Research Group. EMI training is a big part of this development, recognizing that there are marketing opportunities here. What we need to try to think about, though, is how effective is EMI training coming from other contexts? When we think about the strength of what we're doing and measuring the quality assurance of it, that's something that we can measure more easily within the context with people who have background knowledge in those contexts. And this is something that is good to see representation here, that we have members of the British Council, that we have people attending this conference from these different contexts. So we'll be talking about this a bit more, about how to deal with investigating this at different levels.
Okay, so the theme of the conference is employability opportunities, and as we've pointed out, EMI definitely does offer, we do need more research on this, but it's perceived to offer enhanced employability opportunities for students and also teachers. But the moves behind the global transition to EMI in higher education vary according to context. And I've already mentioned that the reasons behind this move in the European context differ somewhat to the more emerging EMI context. In some countries, and also contexts or disciplines, it can offer a way to gain access to cutting-edge knowledge. Some subjects are simply easier to teach in English because of the availability of materials. As we saw from Jim's slide, English does take the lion's share of academic outputs. I'm not saying this is right, but English is the language of academia. Although we have seen a 70% rise in academic outputs from Chinese researchers, so we do have to question what English is now being represented in international publications. As I also pointed out, transitioning to EMI can increase the global competitiveness to raise the international profile by attracting international PhD students, researchers. This can contribute to a brain gain. PhD students may stay on to be researchers and then contribute to the publication profile of the university. It can increase income. This is particularly important in places like Japan, where EMI has actually been described as being a lifeline of the universities. Japan has an aging population, and they're struggling to recruit domestic students for the universities. So as I mentioned, there's been a string of very highly funded government policies to attract international students to Japan. How do you do this? You have to offer programs in English. And I've started doing some research with the international students there. So it can compensate for shortages at the domestic level. This is controversial, but in some cases, English can be seen as a neutral language in education. It can enhance student and lecturer mobility. This is definitely one of the main reasons behind moves in Europe. Enhance the employability. But in the context in which we've been working on, and we're going to present this more in the panel, we see that EMI is very much intertwined with the government's desire to improve the English proficiency of their workforce. Knowledge of one's subject is no longer seen to be sufficient to survive in today's globalized world. Developing the English proficiency of a government's citizens is very high on the modernisation agenda of governments around the globe. And the spread towards EMI is also very much linked towards developments in English language teaching. We've had a transition from grammar-based teaching to more communicative methods. And the pendulum swung right this way towards communicative language, task-based, content-based, and now full immersion in EMI. EMI in some contexts is often seen as an easy option to improve English proficiency, despite the fact that there's very, very few studies that have actually examined this. So improving the English proficiency of a workforce is a key motivating factor for most nations. As Spolsky points out, English as a global language is now a factor that needs to be taken into account in its language policy by any nation state. Another example from the Japanese context, this is because I've been working there quite a lot recently, is the Japanese Business Federation, Keidanren, is putting a lot of pressure on the Ministry of Education now to put efforts into improving English language teaching, and that has resulted in more EMI provision. And as I mentioned, it's very much related to developments in English language teaching. This is problematic. As Jim will point out, by definition, EMI has no language learning objective. And as we'll also point out, despite the fact that language-related challenges have dominated our data, English language support is provided in quite a haphazard way in some contexts.
When we talk about the challenges of EMI provision, implementing EMI, we should talk about technology, actually. It's a really exactly. It's a very difficult thing that we have to try to overcome. Anyway, moving into our different ideas, the last question was about the driving forces behind EMI in your context, and that question was designed to get you to think about how the challenges of EMI affect your understanding about it and what it means to you within your specific context. Because it is going to be a contextualization and thinking about the levels of contextualization that will allow us to move forward with EMI research. Okay, so apologies about not being able to show you that, but we're going to move into a discussion around the definitions and approaches of EMI and those differences. One of the big issues around what we've seen so far in defining EMI is that we define it within national contexts. The problem with that is models of EMI are different within the same countries and indeed within the same institutions. This is what we're finding in our research and something that you probably recognize as well. For those of you who are academics, within your institutions, you see differences even between you and your colleague down the hall. Right? That's the kind of level that we need to be paying more attention to, especially with the way that policy is demanding particular things around EMI. We need to actually see it right at that practice level. Defining English medium instruction. Now, I'm drawing on Ernesto Macaro's work. This is also the work that British Council draws on, and this is definitely the kind of origins of where EMI has really taken off. So a very often cited definition of Ernesto's is from his 2018 book, the use of the English language to teach academic subjects other than English itself in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. So we don't see EMI in English-speaking countries such as the UK, but we do see it in countries here. And it doesn't mean that you may not have native speakers in classes, in EMI classes. A valuable alternative definition, one that comes from a definition of English medium education, in fact. This was from Naoko Taguchi 5 years ago. And she explained that English medium education curricula uses English as a medium of instruction for basic and advanced courses to improve students' academic English proficiency. Focus is on language development. This is different from the kind of policy description that we get from Macaro's work. In their systematic review of EMI research, Macaro and his team state that the labels given to the phenomenon of EMI and their definition are inconsistent and problematic. All right, so being able to apply an understanding about EMI universally really doesn't make much sense. But we need to figure out exactly what that means. I'm going to give you a little exercise, and this technology will work because you don't need the internet for it. This is a continuum that I developed with Jean Thompson, and one that may be familiar to some of you. At one end of content-driven courses, we think about focus on content, all right? And at the other end, we're looking at focus on language. Now, along this continuum, we have a number of different approaches to making this happen, and a few of those options are here in of course, our notorious acronym form, which we overdo in applied linguistics research. Anyway, the first one, ESP, English for specific purposes, right? So this is teaching English with a focus on a specific topic and content. CLIL, this is content and language integrated learning, right? So looking at teaching content and language side by side, integrated. CBI is content-based instruction, right? So it's teaching language with a use of a particular focus topic, subject matter. Also then immersion is another approach, which has kind of drifted into more focus on bilingual education, but basically the idea that you are surrounding yourself in the target language. What I would like to ask you to do is just with the people next to you, or if you're an independent worker, that's okay too, see if you can figure out where to place these different approaches along this continuum. Which ones are more content-driven? Which ones are more language-driven? Just take a moment and I'll reveal the answers. This may be surprising for some of you, but placing immersion as close to content as you can is certainly the origins and ideas behind it, right? So that immersion is about the instruction of the subject rather than the language, right? Whereas at the other end, we find English for specific purposes. Now that one may be confusing, but the reality is it is a course on English, right? What we do see though is quite a lot of English for specific purposes integrated in EMI, right? So really we could actually also have a continuum for ESP, right? That kind of places ourselves along there as well. Okay, this quote from Obaid Hamid and his research team is a really important one when we're thinking about ways of moving research forward. Some institutions purport that EMI is a relatively simple and cheap solution to both the problems of internationalization and upgraded local language proficiency. This is part of this idea of EMI being some kind of magic thing. Right, so policy implementation or policy decisions will be made to try to cover these ideas, right? It's international and it's language focused, great, just do everything in English. How much sense does that really make, though? Nicola's going to explain a few points on that.
So just to go back to Jim's slide there, not only do we have different driving forces behind the movement towards EMI in higher education in different contexts, we have problematic definitions, but also varying conceptualizations of what EMI means. And some of you in the room may place EMI on different ends of this continuum. Because of this, what we found in our observations of universities is that there's various approaches to implementing this macro-level policy at the institutional level. And this relates to the definitions and conceptualizations of EMI. There are no clear policy statements. As I mentioned, EMI tends to be a top-down policy that's implemented in a rather haphazard way. No national policy guidelines or institutional policy guidelines, learning outcomes, language policy guidelines. Yeah, there's a real need for this, an examination of this. So we found that there are various levels of support offered to students, and I've found all three of these models in my research, as well as some others. Some universities offer a preparatory year, so they'll offer a year-long EAP or ESP course for students to help them learn academic skills to study content through English. Others operate in a more sheltered EMI with a semi-CLIL focus. They may have EAP and ESP in the first and second year, and then they start to introduce more content classes in third and fourth years. Others operate more like Anglophone nations. They will have an entrance test, and then students are offered no support whatsoever. It's simply assumed that because they've achieved a certain level of English proficiency, they can manage to study their academic content through the medium of English. And I think it's important to talk to students and staff in these contexts with these different models to investigate more a best practice model. So moving on then to the challenges, just to finish, we've got 5 minutes.
All right, so yeah, just quickly, about some of these challenges, one of the issues, of course, is the idea that we have some top-down policy that then makes the realization of English medium instruction potentially a bit difficult. EMI is promoted as part of an internationalization process and the development of students' English proficiency. Great. However, top-down policies have not always, in our research we're finding this, taken into account the attitudes and the impact on stakeholders. What we would like to see more of is research that recognizes that difference by looking at contexts in particular where there are bottom-up processes. We'll be talking about some of these specific contexts in the panel later this morning with Andrew, and we will try to develop some more ideas around how we can balance that out between the focus on top-down and bottom-up processes.
So no education innovation is straightforward, and as I mentioned at the start, achieving successful and sustainable policy implementation is a complex process, and it's important to understand the challenges to implementing this. There are a number of different challenges, but we've only got time to focus on the first one, which is language-related challenges, and this relates to English proficiency as well as the impact on national language as well. It is concerning that there are these various approaches to supporting students, particularly if the goal of the transition to EMI is related to developing English proficiency. Students need support. Teachers need support. We need training. It's often suggested that CEFR B2 is a good starting point for students, and it's been suggested in the literature that B1 students can survive with extra support. But if we look, this is again an example from the Japanese context, They use the ACEN test, and pre-2 level is roughly equal to CEFR A2, which is a full level below B1. And in 2015, only 11.5% of high school graduates had achieved this. So I'd ask you to think about your own context and what is the average level of your high school graduate, and are they ready to transition to EMI? Okay, a lot of you are shaking their heads. Okay. And we need to think about how can we prepare our students, how can we support our students. This is the movement, okay? And the growth rates are really quite surprising, but we need to think about the students here. Language-related challenges have dominated my own research. Students have reported finding it too challenging. They're very concerned about learning their major and their subject knowledge. It's taking them a longer time to complete the course. A lot of the students were taking the Chinese medium course as well as the EMI course. They were borrowing books from students that were not on the EMI program, and a lot of them were dropping out as well. So we have to think then about what English level, but also what English test. And obviously this is very controversial, and it throws up notions of how we define competency in EMI, proficiency. A lot of these standardized tests that are benchmarked to native English norms. And as Jim mentioned as well, there seems to be an assumption that students who meet the desired entrance requirements can shift to EMI seamlessly, but our own research has showed that this is simply not the case. So just to end then, do we have time? We should, yeah.
All right, so this is, this is a very quick video. It just gives you an idea of, of what the experience is for people who've suddenly been placed in a situation where English is the medium. All right, this is from a company called Nissan, and the employees are experiencing a sudden shift to the use of English as the medium in their company, and also dealing with native-speaking bosses as well. So yeah, let's have a look at how well those employees survive.
社の公用語を英語にします。何言ってんだあの社長。俺トイック300点。俺なんて英検3級。今さら英語なんて。日本語だって怪しいのに。あれが新しい上司か。はい。Pardon? 通じてません。やっぱり無理。英検3級なめんな。How are you? Fine, thank you. And you. Survive. Cup noodle mission.
Okay. Now, there may be some reality here when you think about the experience that students go through, right? When we think about they're suddenly faced with having to use English and survive in English in a particular context. So this is, yeah, I think one that is enjoyable, but certainly a bit of a reality check as well. In terms of considerations about considerations and research directions, directions that we're moving in now. I won't go through all of these, but just really briefly to go back to some of the points that I made earlier. Teacher support and collaboration is very important, recognizing that, yes, language difficulties aren't just with the students, of course. We also have language difficulties at the level of the teacher. How are we providing how are we providing support for them so that they can ensure that the quality of education is still there, that they feel confident, that they're able to work with students in English. Quality assurance, I think that is the other idea that I wanted to highlight. When we think about things like EMI training, how do we make sure that we are providing training within context, right? So the context appropriate and context specific understanding about EMI provision. All right.
Okay, so very quickly, I think it's important when we're thinking about curriculum innovation to draw on curriculum innovation theory. And this was mentioned in the welcome to the conference as well, that we need to think about interlinking all aspects of the curriculum. Rogers outlines 5 different factors that are important when we're thinking about curriculum innovation. The first is relative advantage. Does EMI offer an improvement on the status quo? We need more research to show that this does have a positive impact on students' university experience. Triability, are we going to allow institutions and practitioners to try this out, possibly reinvent it to adapt to their own context? Observability, can we observe best practice or that this does have a beneficial effect? Complexity, is this a very complex innovation? Is it going to succeed? And also, I think the key one here is compatibility. Will this policy fit with the host fabric of the institution? This is a curriculum innovation model, and I won't go over this, but I just want to draw your attention to the third, is it here? Right at the right-hand side here, the institutional phase. There are different phases to implementing curriculum innovation, and the institutionalization phase may appear last chronologically here, but I think it's important for us to examine this at the outset. This is the needs analysis. So before we even consider implementing something, we have to look at resources, availability of teachers, students' proficiency levels. So really look at the environmental constraints to see whether or not this innovation will fit with our national context and also our institution.
Yeah. Just really quickly.
1 minute.
We're thinking about preparing our students and making them more employable. We think about kind of really pushing the idea that we should be able to do everything and function in English. But what we're recognizing is that doesn't reflect actual practices. So sticking with an English-only rule may work for an English language classroom, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense in EMI. It doesn't necessarily reflect the way that we use English outside of the classroom in international contexts. What we also need to recognize is the balance between students in different disciplines and EMI provision in different disciplines. So being able to research across the disciplines will allow us to inform more rather than so much of the research that's been housed in the social sciences. So we'd like to make a call for further research into the implementation of EMI and making clear policy statements and guidelines for the assessment of the effectiveness of EMI, quality assurance.
And just finally, one of the key findings, we have managed this in 34 minutes. One of the key findings from a lot of the research has been a lack of collaboration between researchers and practitioners, and also between content practitioners and EAP practitioners. So in light of this, I've set up a global network. We have 39 international coordinators. It is a work in progress. We're going to be talking to the British Council about this. It did come out of the British Council research, but it really is to be a knowledge-sharing platform and also resource-sharing platform to develop a community of practice for those of us interested and both involved in EMI. So if you're interested in this, then please do get in touch with either of us and we can give you more information. Thank you very much.